Hola, buenos dias. My name is Todd Einhorn. I'm a professor at Michigan State University. And I'd like to begin by thanking Patricio and the organizing committee for the invitation to present to you. I'd like to give a brief synopsis of the growth and development of sweet cherry fruit and some limiting factors with particular attention paid to water deficit. I thought I could begin first by describing some fruit growth patterns and contrast those in the above figure of pome fruit, pears and apples per se, to the below figure of stone fruit, which comprise cherries. The top figure shows sort of what we would describe as an exponential linear growth curve. So this early portion of growth after full bloom is exponential. It's due to cell division. It's followed by a linear phase. It sort of plateaus out around maturation. It's a bit different from a typical stone fruit growth curve, which has three phases. We like to say this first phase is the cell division phase. The second phase, which is not entirely flat, but it's attributed to pit hardening, where the fruit growth sort of slows or ceases entirely for some period of time. And that's then followed by a cell expansion phase, which is somewhat linear until the end of the fruit development period. I'd like to just point your attention to the pre-bloom period to describe and show you a little bit about how these ovaries that become cherries are developing. So these data are taken from dormancy. This would be Northern Hemisphere data, all the way to full bloom, which is somewhere around May 15 here. You can ignore the negative values, but this is essentially a curve of the log volume of the ovary, which is the lower portion of this pistil, which we isolated from a dormant bud in this period of time. And you can see the phenology of cherry buds all the way to bloom. The idea here is that cherry buds and their ovaries are growing in the order of 6 orders of magnitude. So it's like a 1,000,000-fold difference in the size of this ovary from dormancy to full bloom. There's not a whole lot you can do about that outside of controlling potentially some stresses the season prior. What's really interesting in terms of sweet cherry is that at bloom, so these data show days from anthesis or full bloom, and this is the number of cells along a line in the fruit of the mesocarp of cherry. And what these data show is that the cell division period is really quite short. It's only about 14 days. So within 2 weeks, cell divisions are over. And they're occurring during this early period of ovary growth prior to bloom, because when you come to bloom, half of the cells are already present in the fruit. So there's only one round of cell divisions that occur from bloom. It explains why it's very difficult to affect cell division in sweet cherry via stress, especially when it comes to something like water. There's a very nice piece of work that compared a series of different cultivars. Those would be shown on the right. These are scanning electron micrographs. It shows the fruit tissue, the mesocarp tissue of large fruited cherry, which would be B, all the way down to very small fruited genotype, which would be F. And these researchers compared a few different cultivars of cherries, and within each cultivar, over 2 years, they looked at a large fruit and a small fruit at harvest. And then they compared, did some work, anatomical work, and showed the number of cells and the length of the cells. And for each variety, within the variety, the difference between a big fruit and a small fruit was not explained by the number of cells. They were essentially unchanged. The difference was attributed to the size of the cell. So in sweet cherry, you could say that the fruit size at harvest within a cultivar depends very strongly on the size of the cells. We know this. We know we can alter, influence negatively the fruit size when we stress cherries later in their growth period. However, I think it's very interesting to note that Sila, which is a big fruited genotype, has roughly double the cell number than Bing or Regina. And it would suggest that really it's the number of cells that affects the final size of the fruit. It's just very difficult to manipulate the number of cells in cherry because the period is so rapid. I would also like you to realize that cell growth is not just limited to stage 3 or phase 3 in that growth curve I showed you earlier. So these are cells expressed as the log volume of the cell on the left, the axis, from days from full bloom. And you can ignore the symbols, they're different years and different cultivars, but the idea is that the cell growth curve reflects very strongly the curve of the fruit in terms of its growth. So cells are growing all the way through the cell division stage. I like you just to consider this idea of growth potential. This was described by Ted DeYoung at UC Davis. He's a peach physiologist, and it describes potential fruit growth as analogous to a compound interest rate in financial terms, where fruit growth or financial growth is dependent upon the size of the fruit at the start of any interval. So that would be like the principal in a financial growth model, and the rate of growth of the fruit during that time interval, which would be equivalent to the interest rate. If any one of those two, fruit size at the beginning of an interval, or the principal, or the rate of growth, or the interest, is less than maximum, you will have smaller growth or less potential fruit growth for that time interval. If growth then is below the maximum, you can start a new time interval, say the next day or the next week that you're measuring growth, and everything can be optimized in terms of the rate of growth. But of course, you cannot make up the lost growth if you start at a smaller fruit size. What this principle suggests is something you probably already know, but it's interesting to consider that you really cannot stress fruit growth or size at any point in the season and expect to be able to get it back. We have done some work with sweet cherry to look at the growth phase, and we're showing this growth curve again. This is log volume from dormant. So this would be the ovary within the bud, to bloom, and then all the way through phase 1, 2, and 3. The different colors reflect different phenology stages, and the curve is based on over 10,000 different fruit. I use this curve to illustrate the growth potential slide I just explained, because the fruit at the top of the curve, so those that are growing at maximum, in this case are also developmentally advanced. So they have both larger growth or fruit size, and they're advanced such that they exit the cell division stage, in this case, at about 20 days after bloom, and they enter phase 2 or pit hardening. Fruit at the lower portion of the curve, so the smallest growing fruit, are delayed by roughly 20 days. And I think this illustrates quite well that you could never make up 20 days in growth when we harvest the fruit at one event or one timing based on the color of the fruit. So what can you do about that? There's not a whole lot. We've tried to do a little bit of work to understand these different relationships. And what we're showing here is quite simple. The relationship between the bud, the reproductive bud size, the flowers in those buds, and the ovaries, or the future fruit of the pistil within the flowers in the bud, anywhere from 30 days before bloom until full bloom. What these data show is that there's a linear positive relationship between bud, flower, and ovary, which suggests that the larger the bud, the larger the ovary or future fruit. So this idea of growth potential is already established at bloom. There's not a whole lot you can do. A small bud that has a small flower and a small ovary will never be a big fruit at the end of the season. So from a cultural standpoint, you could look at bud removal as a way of fruit thinning, and of course you would need a nice systematic training system orchard to do that in. But I think the cost could pencil out if you got rid of the small buds, which are going to be largely cull fruit anyway. We also did a few experiments then to test this. And the way we did this experiment was we left limbs with the same number of buds on a limb, but all the buds on a limb were either large, medium, or small buds. These are relative and rough classifications. But the idea is we removed all the other reproductive buds. We left all the vegetative buds alone. And then at harvest, we collected the fruit and we looked at the fruit size. And what you see is the fruit that came from the small buds are in blue. The fruit from the medium buds are in sort of a darker purple here. And then the red histogram shows the fruit that came from the largest buds. And it's very clear that the largest buds produced the largest fruit. They were also advanced relative to flowering. So they had about a 4-day advance in general in this study in terms of their bloom timing. So there was more time as well to develop on the tree. We then did another study where we tagged flowers as they opened within one bloom period. And these data were from a Lappin's sweet cherry block, where we came into the orchard in the first day. We tagged flowers that were at bloom phase that we knew would open within that day. We came back 3 days later and tagged again another series of flowers, and then we came back 1 week later on day 7 and tagged flowers. Again, at the commercial harvest date, we harvested all of the fruit. We had about something like 500 to 1,000 flowers labeled in each one of these. And what you see is really not too surprising. The flowers that opened on the first day of the bloom period were significantly larger in their diameter. They had higher sugar content. They were redder in terms of their CTFL color score. And in this case, they had lower firmness because they were maturing earlier than the flowers that opened 7 days later. So bloom timing is really important, and it's connected with development to fruit size. The cultural implications of this is that in terms of frost regions, you need to protect your early phenology stages. We often look at the average bloom phase and try to protect, in terms of frost fans, etc., that stage. But it's really important to protect your earliest blooming stages because they're going to be the largest fruit. If you can remove bees earlier than letting them stay for the entire bloom period, so long as weather looks good and you don't have a frost, I would suggest doing that as well. Once again, late blooming buds are probably smaller, and because of both of those factors, they're going to produce smaller fruit. Okay. So there are many factors that affect cell expansion and growth. You're probably pretty familiar with them. Of course, light we need for photosynthesis, for fruit sizing. You can modify your canopy architecture to improve light relations. Temperature, I don't think we have the optima temperatures that drive photosynthesis, respiration of fruit, vegetative organs, so that we can have an effective temperature curve for these different processes, which by having that, we could then alter potentially the temperatures in orchards using misting or cooling or any other number of cultural techniques. Obviously, crop load affects cell expansion and growth. If we have heavy, excessive crop loads, we can decrease fruit size. Nutrient availability, there's many factors that go into this, and I think we're going to hear more about this in the presentation later. But related to this, the topic of this conference being water and water stress, we know that water stress reduces growth. The amount that different organs can withstand requires some information on scheduling, the frequency of irrigation, soil information, etc., etc. And I'm going to describe some of that now. So what are the key factors that first influence water use in cherry trees? And what tools or information in blue, what would you need to manage that? What I have here is a series of different components that go into the evapotranspiration, or ET. Those factors like solar radiation and light that provide the energy source for photosynthesis. They provide the energy source for water to evaporate or change phase. And then humidity and wind are responsible for the vapor pressure deficit that allows the water vapor to move from the leaf to the atmosphere and drive ET. You need weather stations and ET models to effectively monitor these components, and then of course schedule your irrigations to refill the profile or fill the ET that's left the orchard. Ideally, you need to know the canopy leaf area, because leaf area is directly proportional to water use, and you can obviously alter leaf area by your training system and architecture, whether or not you're applying compounds or using the crop, etc., to control vigor. Crop load, possibly not as much as pome fruit. Would crop load have a limiting degree on water use, unless it's extremely excessive and reduces, of course, if it's excessive, then you reduce the leaf area, and that could reduce transpiration. You can thin, obviously, and manage your crop load by either pruning or any number of techniques to thin the fruit. The other factors, obviously, that are important for influencing water use is your soil moisture reserves and whether or not you're in a drought. And so for that, you can do soil moisture monitoring. You need to understand the soil texture analyses. And ideally, have soil maps, and maybe even do some excavation to understand where your roots are in terms of their rooting depth, so you know what soil profile you should be looking at in terms of depth and the water that's stored in it. How do you deal with heterogeneous soils? In this map here, each different color polygon, we call these polygons, is a different soil series, and this is a very small piece of land. This is at the Michigan State University teaching farm. Now, these are glacial soils, so there's a lot of different mixed textural properties to these soils. This is a map of an orchard in Washington State in the USA, and this map was done by electrical conductivity. Again, each one of the colors shows a different soil classification. I think if you could gain precision in our systems, one of the places to do this would be mapping your soils, ideally before you plant or put in a new orchard. From that mapping information, then you could develop and capitalize on some of the variable rate technology for irrigation that's available, so that you can gain necessary precision. So how do you reduce irrigation without reducing fruit size or quality and cherry? It's tricky. You may have heard of the term regulated deficit irrigation. It was developed in the late 70s by David Chalmers and others. The idea of regulated deficit irrigation is to provide irrigation below plant demand at specific time intervals throughout the season. And that's based on different growth patterns. So for instance, this shows peach. This is Southern Hemisphere data showing the shoot growth of peach is pretty much completely done. By the time only about 25% of the fruit growth is done, fruit exiting pit hardening here. So the idea is in this case where these trees, this is a long time ago without dwarfing roots, these were highly vigorous, and one way to reduce the shoot growth and save water by reducing leaf area and shade, etc., was to stress the shoots, and to do it without ideally stressing the fruit. Because the cell division stage, as I showed you, is so short, you can kind of get away with a water stress, which won't even affect those 2 weeks so long as your water profile is full. Affect shoot growth, and then ideally put the water back on full ET so you don't affect fruit growth. The other thing it requires is maybe a differential sensitivity of different tissues or organs to water stress. In apple, this is very difficult to achieve. These are data from Alan Laxo, and they show stem water potential, 0 meaning no stress to negative 2.5, extreme stress. related to the fruit growth rate in millimeters per day of apple. And what you see is pretty much a negative relationship, where if you increase the stress, you decrease fruit growth, which suggests it's very difficult in apple to save water without compromising your fruit size. So where can you potentially achieve water savings in cherry? Well, in stage 1, I would suggest that if soil moisture profile is full coming out of the winter and early spring, then withholding water altogether, that means no water application early, or reducing the irrigation to allow the utilization of water in the deeper soil reserves can absolutely save water. It requires a knowledge of the rooting profile, the depth that is, and then the soil moisture at those different depths of the profile. It's unlikely to create a soil moisture deficit so long as you're monitoring the soil moisture and you have good soil moisture in the profile. Just to remind you, if you just look this in relative terms, if you just look at ET, at full bloom, there's hardly any transpirational demand because there's really no leaf area. By the time you get into phase 2, leaf area is pretty much maximized, and so we're also into the warmer, hotter part of the season, so ET is maximum. But during this early period, you can definitely save water. Stage 2 would be ideal because you saw the fruit growth curve. It's relatively flat because of pit hardening, but it's not such a long duration of time like, say, a late season harvest peach might be, where it can sit for 6 or 8 weeks in a pit hardening phase. I think it's a little challenging to do this. You may be able to achieve a water savings on 1 irrigation set or 2 or something like that before you have to get water back for stage 3, because during that period, there's a lot of cell expansion and fruit growth, and it's a relatively short time period where I would suggest not stressing the tree. However, I am going to propose that you could reduce irrigation at the end of end of stage 3, possibly 10 to even 14 or 2 weeks, 14 days prior to harvest. Post-harvest, I think, is an excellent time to save water. We've seen that when you harvest trees, their transpirational demand drops by roughly half. But you have to use caution, because if you apply an extreme stress when flower buds are developing for the next season, you can create all sorts of problems. This is just showing the vegetative meristems of stone fruit as they're developing in the summer. And this circle I have where the carpel or the ovary, that's going to be the fruit, is developing in late summer, can be interrupted through heat or water stress. And the two of those are very well related. These are photographs of different stone fruit taken in California as affected by water stress, which probably had a heat stress as well. But what was found in this study, at least with peach, was that early season peaches were allowed to develop severe water stress because the growers were monitoring their mid and late season peaches and harvesting, and the early season peaches were going through extreme stress since the fruit was off the tree. What was happening is that extreme stress was leading to twinning or doubling the next year. When experiments put water back on, and sometime around August, that was the timing when floral bud development was occurring, they could significantly reduce and almost eliminate the twinning. So this is certainly a function of water stress. Okay, so those are some ideas about how you could save water. Monitoring water, you can monitor your soil moisture. That's an indirect measure of the plant. It tends to be okay as long as you're monitoring some growth process of the plant. But what's far more direct, and in my opinion better, is measuring the plant water potential directly. It determines the direction of water flow within the plant. It's a simple measure, but it's a manual. It's not something that you can, at least not yet, simply get from downloading some sort of software and having instruments provide the data. You have to go out and take it. However, it's you can entirely create your own threshold values for, say, fruit growth or shoot growth. monitor the plant water potential, and then irrigate when you reach those threshold values. This is an old slide from a classic plant physiology textbook, just showing in general, as water potential gets more negative or there's more stress in the plant, the earliest processes to be affected are cell growth and expansion, which explains why you can lose fruit size when you apply a water stress. You measure water potential with a pressure bomb, and I don't have time to get into this, but it's relatively simple procedure. If you're not familiar with it, I'm sure your consultants can direct you appropriately to doing so. The last part of this talk, I just like to provide some experimental data to show you how we've attempted to save some water using a late season regulated deficit irrigation. So these are called early irrigation termination trials, and I have two sites. This is Skeena on Gisela 6 site we did in 2 years, 256 trees per acre. And the treatments were essentially letting the grower irrigate as normal, which in this case, the grower was irrigating at about 60% of ET. So they needed to conserve water, and they were already applying a season-long deficit. We then cut the water off 5 days before estimated harvest, or 10 days, or 15 days before harvest. And we did this by just plumbing in an extra line of emitters. We had 4 trees for each replication, and we had many replications that we studied these treatments. So here are the Skeena water relations, and I just want to show you. This is stem water potential. So essentially we bag the leaves so they reach an equilibrium with the spur, and then we measure their water potential. The more negative, the more stress. This asterisk around the 24th of June is when we applied the 15-day before harvest water withholding, so no irrigations. The next asterisk is when we applied the 10 days before, and the last one is the 5 days before. The blue is the control, and then the green, brown, and red are the different levels of withholding. We measured then the fruit diameter as well for those different treatments, and you can see the effects of the irrigation treatments on fruit size. What we found from our work is that we feel that a stem water potential value of negative 1.5 megapascal is about the threshold for losing fruit size. And so in the red treatment, when we held 15 days before harvest, we cut the water off its 24th of June. By about the 30th of June, 1st of July, we start to see our water potential drop below negative 1.5. At that same time, you can see the error bars on these red symbols are separated from the blue, suggesting that we're losing fruit size. Now, the brown treatment, when we cut it off 10 days before, it did not drop below negative 1.5 megapascal until about a week before harvest. And you can see how the fruit growth curve responded to that. The fruit started to lose rapid growth. However, they didn't differ from the control significantly because this happened only within a week from harvest. The green had no effect that we could determine. I also like to draw your attention to the fact that these fruit sizes are rather large. This is 28 to 31 millimeter fruit size. So even while we sacrificed fruit size, it was pretty large to begin with. The difference between the most extreme treatment and the control was about 10% in terms of a loss in fruit growth. If we look at the soil moisture profile, so we also measured through a neutron probe the soil moisture, and I'm showing you the same colors and symbols related to the different treatments. These asterisks, again, are when we cut off the 15, 10, and 5 day before harvest withholding of water. And the brown line that's horizontal here represents 50% of the available water in the soil. So it's the fuel capacity of the soil minus the permanent wilting point. Most growers, and I think most textbooks would say, when you get to about 50% of available water depletion, you would want to turn your irrigation back on. You can see in the 15 centimeter depth of the soil profile, we certainly dried that out with the 15-day before harvest withhold. The others sort of balanced more or less around that line. of 50% available water. But look, at 45 centimeters, these trees were all pulling, including the control, because the grower was irrigating at a pretty low ET level. There's a little more water at 60 centimeters, but plants are still pulling, and down to 90 centimeters, they're still Gisela 6 roots, and they're pulling water, as you can see by this deficit irrigation profile, because they're now having less water in the top of the soil, so they're pulling from the reserves down below. This is why it's important to understand the depth of your soil and where the roots are. You could see these trees in a severe stress at the day of harvest looking pretty sad, a little bit wilting because they've pretty much used most of their water. Irrespective, we didn't affect tree yield. We had a slight effect on fruit weight, as you saw in the growth pattern data I showed, but only significantly for the 15-day before harvest water cutoff. This is showing you fruit firmness after 3 weeks of cold storage, and the firmness is reduced by the withholding up to 15 days, but I'd say 360 grams per milliliter is still a very firm piece of fruit. Okay, so in 2015, we repeated the trial, but the grower harvested early because they had a significant heat event, and Skeena is subject to dropping fruit under high heat conditions. So they didn't want stemless fruit, so they harvested early. So our treatments didn't quite make 15 and 10 days. We could only do a 9 and a 3 day before harvest when we started to cut our water off. Here's the fruit size data. You can see we didn't affect fruit size at all by withholding water, even up to 9 days before harvest. If you look at stem water potential, it makes sense because we never got below negative 1.5 megapascal, even for our most stressed treatment. Therefore, we had no effect on the fruit size. I just want to point out that when we're above negative 1.5 megapascal, we have no effect on photosynthesis. So we aren't affecting the carbon intake or carbohydrate status of the fruit. What we're going to show you is that we can affect the relative water content of the fruit. Here's the soil moisture data for the second year, just to give you an idea what that looked like. The grower was provided a little bit more water here in the control, and you can see its response in the 15 centimeter soil depth profile to an irrigation. And you can see that we are beginning to dry out the 9 day before harvest when we cut the water off. You can see the 3 day before harvest also responds very quickly, but it's hardly any time at all before harvest. As we go down in depth, 30 centimeter, 45 centimeter, we're still very close in the control and even below the 50% depletion of available water line of the soil. 60 centimeters, 75 centimeters, and 90 centimeters, there's still quite a bit of water in the profile down deep, and all the trees are pulling that water. And so again, Gisela pulling water from pretty deep in the soil profile. In 2015, we had no effect on yield. We had no effect on fruit size from our treatments. We only had a small effect on pedicel retention force, but it really didn't make a whole lot of sense. And we can say that withholding irrigation for up to 10 days in 2014 and 9 days in 2015 did not have an effect on yield, fruit size, and quality. And I'll show you the type of water savings. We also did this work to try to understand the effect of cracking to see if we could reduce it through our treatments. But in this year, we had no effect whatsoever. You can see the 3 and 9 day treatments. These are cracking data from a benchtop assay. And we had no effect, but it makes sense because we really didn't see any effect on the fruit quality. The last series of slides I'm going to show is our next trial, which is 2015. We also did the work on a sweetheart block. It's the same farm, but in a very different area of the farm. In this case, sweetheart was on Mazard root, but it's the same 256 trees per acre. I should also point out that those yield data for the Skeena were 10.5 and 10 tons per acre. Those were the yield. So the crops were extraordinarily high, and you saw the fruit size was pretty good. The second year fruit size was reduced in 2015 for Skeena, not because of irrigation, but because of some cold injury that was sustained in the fall of 2014. And in fact, that cold injury had a much more marked effect on sweetheart, as you'll see from the yield data. Same treatments. Here, I'm showing you the fruit size data. And what you see here is that the 10 and the 15-day treatments begin to get smaller and smaller compared to the control and the 5-day before harvest treatments. Stem water potential for the sweetheart. This is very interesting because what these data show is that the 10-day before harvest were stressed before we even cut the water off. So even though we had a randomized complete block design, these trees, for whatever reason, had more stress than the other trees, and we were able to determine it. So it's a very good reason and an illustration for why stem water potential is a very good measure of plant stress, and one that I advise you to use if you're really needing to monitor plant water status. This I found was to be very interesting and was somewhat concerning, was this decrease in growth, even for the control treatments, which you can see here had absolutely, well, very little to no stress. We would say -1 MPa is hardly any stress at this time of the season. I thought maybe this was due to the fact that water was leaving the fruit and going to the leaves, because the leaves were under extreme transpirational stress due to the heat. But a very nice piece of work by Moritz Knock in Germany and his colleagues showed that, in fact, the xylem that's supplying water to the fruit is essentially completely disconnected and cut off from the fruit by the time cherries reach harvest. All the water is delivered via the phloem to the fruit, and that's what these data show. So that at maturation, fruit water is lost via transpiration. It's because it's cut off from the tree, the water flow doesn't go from the fruit to the leaves. This sort of process concentrates the solutes, and then it probably limits phloem unloading of water to the fruit, and that explains why all of the water lost through transpiration is not replaced. And we did a little bit of measurement to show that the fruit water potential, in fact, was not lower than the stem water potential or the water potential of the spur itself. Looking at the soil moisture profile here, again, this showed very well that we had water stress in the 10-day before harvest treatment before we even cut them off. So it explains why the fruit size was reduced, similar to the 15-day from bloom harvest. 15-day from harvest treatments. So here's the 50% available water line. You can see we're really below that in the 2 deficit treatments and 15-centimeter soil depth, but we look very good in our other treatments, control in 5 days. This is 30 centimeters, 45 centimeters. They're still pulling very strongly, and you can see the effect of the deficits. 60 centimeters, 75 centimeters, and 90. So here, Mazard, being a very vigorous rootstock, of course, has roots down to 90 centimeters, and it's pulling quite a bit of water, as you can see in these deficit treatments. Yield was not negatively influenced, of course, with that withholding of irrigation. 5 days before harvest had absolutely no effect on the growth quality of Sweetheart. 10 and 15 days reduced the fruit weight 6 to 8%. And that loss was associated with the relative water content or water of the fruit, not the dry matter. So it wasn't a carbohydrate stress because photosynthesis wasn't being compromised. You can see the sugars were a little higher in the 10 and 15-day treatment. And I would contend that had the 10 days not been stressed before, they would have been able to withstand this treatment just like the year before we saw in Skeena. Interestingly, we had a marked effect, positive effect on cracking. So fruit cracking was half in these deficit treatments. And that's probably a function of the fruit having less relative water content, higher sugars, and being able to attract potentially more water before the turgor pressure resulted in cracking. So in the case of cracking, one of these negative attributes turns out to be positive, I would say. What do the water savings look like? So based on these treatments in 2015, Skeena or Sweetheart, the different days before harvest withholding, these are the sets. We were irrigating every third day for 12 hours. This is the water in terms of gallons per acre that we would have saved. And if you take that water savings for these sets and multiply it over, say, a 100-acre farm, which this was, if they were using this across their whole farm, they would have saved in the 15-day before harvest cutoff 3.6 million gallons. They could have easily saved 21 or 2.2 million gallons of water and had absolutely no effect whatsoever on the fruit quality. So I contend that there are large water savings to be had, potentially certainly in the last week before harvest, if not in the last 10 days. I'd advise you, if you're doing this, to have a very good monitoring of your soil moisture and even better, potentially, your water potential in your plant. With that, I'd like to wrap that up. I thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you all the best in 2021.